The women's rights demonstrations of 1979 broke a barrier of oppression for Iranian women. Today, the Iranian parliament is composed of 6% women. This was made possible by their predecessors who fought for their rights when they were under attack. The women's rights protests of March 1979 changed the social structure of Iran. The movement set a tone of resistance throughout the country and demonstrated that Iranian women would not tolerate oppression. In 1979, after the Iranian Islamic Revolution and the installment of fundamentalist Ayatollah Khomeini, Iranian women demonstrated in the streets to shatter a barrier of oppression related to the newly imposed dress code. Mandatory public veiling was only a visual representation of a deeper injustice. The protests were a direct response to the repeal of protective regulations and the implementation of oppressive laws against women. These demonstrations created a legacy of feminism and laid the foundation for future protests across the Middle East. In the late 70s, Iran was immersed in a domestic and foreign conflict. Reza Shah, the leader of Iran, was driven into exile during the Iranian Islamic Revolution. The revolution lasted almost 2 years and was composed of non-stop demonstrations demanding the overthrow of the Shah. The Shah of Iran was disliked by many for his policies that favored the upper class. He was viewed as a dictator. Citizens were upset by his corruption and ignited by a religious reform movement that favored a return to the fundamentals of Islam. The anti-imperialist movement was determined to overthrow the Shah. Although he was a flawed leader, he was secular and favored more progressive laws when it came to women's rights. Prior to the revolution, Iranian women attended university dressed in fashion that reflected the global trends of what was popular in the 1970s and were afforded the same rights as women in Western countries. On September 8, 1978, later known as Black Friday, the Iranian military under command of Reza Shah killed and injured approximately 15,000 resistance protesters. The revolutionary demonstrations escalated until the military could no longer contain them, and eventually the Shah was pushed into exile. A patron of the revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini assumed power and was supported by the movement. He was initially thought to be the one who would bring about change. He was favorable to domestic interests and supported national ownership of oil. Many people believed that he would be the one to squash economic injustice. However, Khomeini followed a fundamentalist interpretation of Islam. The result of this was a restriction on the rights of women. Shortly after assuming power, Khomeini began eliminating the laws in place to protect women. Within a month, he had imposed a mandatory dress code for women. Historically, in Iran, only some practicing Muslim women would wear the veil. It was viewed as an expression of their faith. Khomeini instituted it as mandatory for all women to cover their heads in public, regardless of their religious beliefs. The veil changed from a symbol of expression to a symbol of oppression. In addition to mandatory veiling, stoning and polygamy were legalized, and other actions were taken against the rights of women, such as the repeal of the Family Protection Act, which made it illegal for women to file for divorce and lowered the marriage age to 9 years old. In addition to restrictive legislation, women in public offices were killed or forced to resign. Farrokhrough Parsa, the first woman to serve in the Iranian parliament, was executed. Female artists were forbidden from performing in public and releasing music. Gagouche, an influential musician and icon of modern fashion, was forced into hiding.
Gagouche spent years in seclusion at home in Iran. Islamic law effectively forbids her from doing what she loves, performing and recording her music.
You tell someone that you can't sing or can't act or can't live with your art for this long, for this time, huh? For 20 years, you can't work.
Women played a large role in the revolution and the overthrow of the Shah. They fought alongside men for what they thought would lead to freedom. Instead, the new leader was even worse. Beginning on March 8, 1979, Iranian women staged a 5-day peaceful protest against the newly instituted oppressive laws. Tens of thousands of women gathered in the streets of Tehran and took part in these demonstrations, coming together to fight for their freedom. A central leader of these demonstrations, Kata Vafadari, stated the following: "We all fought together, all the men and the women, with all different ideas, all different beliefs, against the tyranny. We threw out the Shah. Today, we don't want anyone to separate us. There is freedom if all the Iranians are free, both men and women." These women faced severe backlash. Men pointed guns at them while chanting, "Cover your heads or be smacked in the head." Veiled and unveiled women marched hand in hand to fight for their right to choose how to dress. The imposed veil was a visual symbol of a new legislation put in place as a barrier to limit women. Protesters chanted the motto of the Iranian women's movement: "We didn't make a revolution to go backwards, but to live in a free society and to live a free life." Another chant translated to, "There are no musts and mustn'ts in freedom." In particular, women who had helped in overthrowing the Shah felt betrayed. Their efforts to eliminate tyranny backfired and pushed them into a worse situation. During the Islamic Revolution, a chant used was "Independence, Freedom, Islamic Republic." The women of the March 1979 demonstrations reappropriated this chant for their own use. There could not be independence or freedom unless everyone, including women, benefited. The institutional corruption of religion led to oppression under the guise of a return to traditional Islam. These protests broke a barrier of oppression of Iranian women by demonstrating that women would not tolerate brutality and domination. This event is often referred to as the first real feminist movement of Iran. Eventually, they were forced by the government to stop. The movement was pacified by Ayatollah Khomeini calling for a national referendum on Iran becoming an Islamic Republic. The referendum resulted in a majority in favor of Iran becoming an Islamic Republic. Women who took part in these demonstrations exhibited bravery that set an example for generations to come. Many women were killed over the course of these 5 days fighting for their rights. These brave women came together and challenged the new regime's backward slide towards enforcing traditional women's roles. By demonstrating that they would not stand for being treated unequally, they chipped away at the barriers of oppression and set an example for future generations, allowing women in Iran today to continue to break them down. The Iranian women's rights demonstrations of 1979 lit a flame of feminism in Iran and throughout the Middle East that burns on through today. Many women's rights movements have been modeled after this, such as the Women's March celebrated worldwide on International Women's Day. Rights are still very limited for Iranian women, but progress has been made. Today, several women hold positions in parliament. However, mandatory head covering is still law, and women cannot travel without permission from their husbands. Today, Iranian women still rebel against the dress code by removing their veils in public demonstrations. Iranian women continue to resist oppressive rules. The women's rights demonstrations of 1979 are responsible for igniting a movement that lives on through today.